The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. Eleanor had lived alone for almost a decade now, her days blending into a seamless loop of solitude. At 53, her world was one of routines: morning tea at the window, tending to her small garden, and weekly grocery trips that felt more like a chore than a necessity. Her life wasn't unhappy, but it lacked the spark she'd once thought was indispensable. That Tuesday was no different. With her reusable shopping bag slung over her shoulder, Eleanor wandered the aisles of her local grocery store, scanning shelves with little enthusiasm. Her list was predictable: milk, bread, fresh vegetables, but she moved with care, as if the act of shopping might stretch out her time in the company of strangers. She was reaching for a jar of honey on the top shelf when she first noticed him. A man young, maybe in his late 20s, stepped in beside her, effortlessly plucking the jar she struggled to reach. He turned to her with a polite smile and handed it over. "Here you go," he said. The interaction lasted mere seconds, but something about his warm, unhurried demeanor stayed with her. She thanked him, her voice betraying a touch of surprise, and he nodded before moving on. It was a fleeting moment, but Eleanor's heart stirred in a way it hadn't in years. As she finished her shopping and headed to the checkout, she caught sight of him again. He was loading groceries into a basket, his movements deliberate and confident. For reasons she couldn't explain, Eleanor lingered longer in the store than usual, hoping for another glimpse. That night, as she sat with her tea and a half-read novel, Eleanor found her thoughts drifting back to him. She chided herself for being so preoccupied with a stranger, but deep down, she recognized something she hadn't felt in a long time: a flicker of curiosity, a spark of possibility. For the first time in years, her world felt a little less predictable. The following week, Eleanor returned to the grocery store with a new sense of anticipation. She convinced herself it was silly, that the man she'd seen before was just a passing moment in her otherwise ordinary life. But when she spotted him in the produce section, inspecting a bundle of fresh herbs, her breath caught. He noticed her too, his face lighting up in recognition. "Back for more honey?" he asked with a smile that felt disarming in its simplicity. Eleanor laughed softly, holding up her basket. "Not today, just the usual suspects: lettuce, tomatoes, and whatever else catches my eye." He nodded, extending his hand. "I'm Ian, by the way." The introduction startled her slightly, but she accepted his handshake. "Eleanor," she replied. Their conversation began easily, flowing like a stream over smooth stones. They chatted about seasonal produce, the absurd prices of avocados, and the quirks of the store's layout. Eleanor found herself smiling more than she had in weeks, feeling a lightness in Ian's presence that was both refreshing and unfamiliar. As the weeks passed, these encounters became less coincidental. Ian always seemed to appear near her favorite aisles, and their casual conversations grew longer. They shared snippets of their lives. She told him about her garden and the challenges of caring for roses, while he spoke of his job as a graphic designer and his love for cooking. One afternoon, Ian surprised her by offering a recipe for a roasted vegetable tart. "It's simple," he said, "but it'll make those tomatoes in your basket sing." She accepted his handwritten note, tucking it carefully into her purse. "I'll try it," she promised, feeling a strange thrill at the thought of following his advice. Their connection felt easy and forced. Ian's energy breathed new life into Eleanor's days, and she found herself looking forward to their conversations with a mix of excitement and disbelief. What began as chance meetings had grown into a gentle rhythm, a small but meaningful shift in her routine. Yet, with every interaction, Eleanor felt a growing awareness of the unspoken gap between them, one she wasn't yet ready to confront. For now, she allowed herself to bask in the unexpected joy he brought into her life, savoring the moments as they came. The recipe Ian gave her turned out to be a triumph. As Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, savoring the tart's rich, roasted flavors, she couldn't help but think of him. How he'd spoken with such enthusiasm about cooking, his eyes bright and alive with passion for the small joys of life. A subtle warmth spread through her chest, catching her off guard. It wasn't just the tart that lingered on her mind, it was Ian. That night, Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the realization crept in. It wasn't simply friendship she felt for him. It was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. Her heart pounded as she replayed their conversations in her mind, The way he looked at her, the laughter they shared. It terrified her how much she found herself anticipating their next encounter, how he had become a constant presence in her thoughts. "This is ridiculous," she whispered into the quiet. Eleanor felt conflicted. She hadn't allowed herself to think about romance in years. That chapter of her life felt firmly closed, locked away with the passing of time and the weight of old disappointments. And yet, Ian's presence had awakened something she thought was long gone, a sense of possibility of being seen. But then came the doubts, pressing down on her like heavy clouds. He was younger, significantly so. What could he possibly see in her? Was she reading too much into his kindness? The next time they met, Eleanor found herself more guarded, hesitant to let the warmth of their connection grow further. Ian, perceptive as ever, noticed her reticence. "You okay?" he asked as they stood by the bakery section, his tone gentle but concerned. She forced a smile. "Of course. Just a lot on my mind." He nodded, not pressing further. Instead, he shared a story about a disastrous attempt at making sourdough bread, and soon enough, Eleanor found herself laughing again, her worries momentarily forgotten. But as she walked home, a heaviness settled over her. She couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Her feelings for Ian had grown beyond the boundaries of friendship, and the realization left her both exhilarated and terrified. What was she to do with these feelings? Could she dare to acknowledge them, even to herself? The question swirled in her mind, leaving her restless and unsure of what lay ahead. Eleanor's days were filled with a quiet turmoil. She found herself oscillating between moments of hope and waves of self-doubt. Every time Ian's name lit up her phone, her heart skipped a beat. But as quickly as the excitement came, it was chased by an inner voice laden with caution. "You're being foolish," it would whisper. "He's too young. People will talk." Eleanor couldn't deny the weight of societal judgment. She imagined the raised eyebrows, the whispers, the questioning glances. She had spent decades cultivating a life that avoided scrutiny, preferring the safety of her quiet routine. Could she risk stepping outside that carefully constructed boundary for something that might not even be real? And yet, every time she saw Ian, her reservations seemed to crumble. He had a way of making her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. His genuine interest in her thoughts, his easy laughter, the way he seemed to light up when she spoke. It was all so intoxicating. One afternoon, as they sipped coffee at a small cafe, Ian leaned back in his chair, studying her with a soft smile. "You've got that faraway look again," he said. "Do I?" she replied, caught off guard. "Yes," he said, tilting his head. "Like there's a whole world of thoughts you're not sharing." The vulnerability in his words disarmed her. "Maybe I do," she admitted, stirring her cup absent-mindedly. Ian smiled but didn't push. That was part of what made being with him so comforting. He never pried, never demanded more than she was willing to give. But that only deepened her longing. Later that evening, Eleanor sat by her window, watching the moonlight cast a silvery glow over the quiet street. Her heart ached with the weight of her unspoken feelings. She knew she couldn't stay in this limbo forever. She had to confront what she wanted, no matter how terrifying it was. But the fear of rejection, of losing the connection they shared, was paralyzing. "What if I ruin everything?" she whispered into the night. But another voice, a quieter, more persistent one, began to emerge. It reminded her of the life she had been living before Ian. The routine, the loneliness, the feeling that her best days were behind her. What if this was her chance to reclaim something she thought was lost? What if, against all odds, he felt the same way? The question swirled in her mind, and for the first time in years, Eleanor found herself daring to hope. The idea had been brewing in Eleanor's mind for days. Each time she saw Ian, she thought about creating an opportunity to invite him into her world, a space she had carefully kept private for so long. But the thought terrified her. What if he declined? Worse, what if he accepted, and the dynamic between them shifted uncomfortably? Late one evening, as Eleanor tidied her already spotless living room, she caught her reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. The woman looking back at her seemed almost unrecognizable, nervous, hopeful, vulnerable. She took a deep breath and let her gaze settle. "Enough," she whispered aloud. "Enough doubting." The next day, they met for coffee at their usual spot. Ian arrived with his usual energy, his smile warming her instantly. "I was thinking," Eleanor began, trying to sound casual as her fingers tightened around her mug, "that you might like to try my infamous vegetable tart. I've been told it's life-changing." Ian chuckled, his eyes bright. "Are you offering me dinner, Eleanor? Because that sounds like a very enticing invitation." Her cheeks flushed. "I am," she admitted. "But only if you're free this Saturday." "I'd love to," Ian replied, his response immediate and sincere. Eleanor felt a flutter of relief and something more, a thrill she hadn't felt in years. They spent the rest of their conversation planning the details, but Eleanor's mind was already racing ahead to the preparations she'd need to make. As Saturday approached, she threw herself into creating the perfect evening. She polished her grandmother's silver candlesticks, arranged fresh flowers, and poured over every ingredient for the meal. But more than anything, she found herself thinking about Ian, how he might see her home, how he might feel sitting across her dining table. When the day finally arrived, Eleanor stood in her kitchen, wearing a dress she hadn't worn in years. It was simple but elegant, with soft blue fabric that brought out her eyes. She glanced at the clock, feeling her nerves spike as the minutes ticked closer to Ian's arrival. When the doorbell rang, her heart skipped. She smoothed her dress and opened the door to find Ian standing there, holding a bottle of wine and a bouquet of daisies. "Hi," he said, his grin disarming. "I hope I'm not too early." "Not at all," she said, stepping aside to let him in. As Ian entered, his presence seemed to fill the room, chasing away her earlier apprehension. Eleanor smiled, realizing that, for the first time in years, her house felt alive. This was a night she wouldn't soon forget. The evening unfolded like a dream, each moment richer than the last. Eleanor had underestimated the depth of connection she would feel with Ian once he crossed the threshold of her home. His presence felt so natural, so unforced, like a puzzle piece that had finally found its place. As they settled at the table, the soft glow of candlelight illuminating their faces, the world outside her small house ceased to exist. "Your tart really is life-changing," Ian said, cutting another generous bite and looking up at her with that knowing smile. Eleanor felt a surge of warmth wash over her, his words an unexpected compliment that left her heart racing. "I'm glad you think so," she replied, her voice steady but her insides still fluttering. "I guess the secret is, well, it's more love than technique, really." Ian's gaze lingered on her, a quiet understanding between them. "You put care into everything you do. It's obvious." The conversation flowed easily between them, their shared laughter and stories filling the spaces in the room. Ian spoke of his travels, his childhood memories, and his dreams for the future, things he never seemed to share with anyone else. For Eleanor, each word was like a thread that slowly wove him deeper into her life. But it wasn't just the stories that captivated her. It was the way he listened, truly listened, with such presence and warmth. She had forgotten how intoxicating it could be to feel seen, to feel important. As the evening stretched on, they lingered over their empty plates, the last of the wine now in their glasses. Ian leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. Eleanor could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in the space between them. It was no longer just a shared meal, it was something more. Eleanor could feel her pulse quicken, the weight of his gaze sending a tingle down her spine. A part of her wanted to pull away, to protect the fragile bubble of their connection. But another part, the part that had been dormant for far too long, yearned to see where this could go. She could feel her feelings for him, feelings that had bloomed so slowly over the past weeks, intensify in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "You know," Ian said softly, breaking the silence, "I'm glad I said yes to this." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "I've never felt so comfortable with someone I barely know." The words felt like an invitation, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what he meant exactly, but she knew what it meant for her. It meant she wasn't alone in this unspoken thing between them. Without thinking, Eleanor set her glass down and slowly closed the distance between them, her hand instinctively reaching for his. Ian's hand was warm, and when he clasped hers, the world outside that cozy dining room seemed to vanish. "Neither have I," she whispered, surprised at the honesty in her own voice. For a long moment, they simply sat there, hand in hand, the connection between them undeniable. No words were needed. It was in the way their fingers gently interlaced, in the way their eyes met and held each other's gaze. It was the space between heartbeats, the intimacy of sharing something unspoken but deeply felt. And in that quiet, intimate moment, Eleanor realized that this wasn't just a fleeting connection. This was something that could change everything. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Eleanor. The moment Ian left her home, she was both elated and overwhelmed, her mind racing with questions and doubts. It felt so natural, so right and yet so foreign. She had spent decades living cautiously, guarding her heart, not allowing it to wander too far. Now, here she was, vulnerable, exposed, caught in the delicate pull of a connection that defied expectations. Eleanor spent hours reflecting on that evening. The way Ian had looked at her, the way his touch had sent a shiver through her that no one had evoked in years. It wasn't just his youth or the way his laughter filled the room. It was something deeper, something that had awakened within her. For the first time in so long, she felt truly seen. Not as the woman defined by her age, her responsibilities, or her past, but as someone full of possibility, someone capable of love, capable of desire. It was a strange feeling. She hadn't allowed herself to think of love in such terms for years. She had accepted the quiet rhythm of her life, telling herself that romance was something for the young, for those still living in the throes of possibility. But now Ian had shattered that belief. With every conversation, with every look, he made her realize that love wasn't bound by age or time. It was a force that could strike at any moment in any form. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered to herself one evening as she sat in her living room, tracing the edge of her wineglass. She had so many fears. Could she really open her heart to someone so much younger? Was it fair to him? And yet, deep down, she knew that if she didn't allow herself to explore this, she would regret it. She had spent too many years holding back, too many years living cautiously. She thought of the way Ian had smiled at her, the way he listened, truly listened, to every word she said. There was no judgment in his eyes, no expectation, just a shared understanding. And in his presence, she remembered what it felt like to be wanted, to be cherished, to be loved not for her past or her mistakes, but for the woman she was in the here and now. Wasn't that what love was supposed to be? The acceptance of who you are, the ability to make each other better, to bring out parts of one another that had been dormant for too long. Eleanor knew she couldn't let fear dictate her future. She had spent too many years hiding behind the walls of self-doubt and societal expectations. In that moment, she chose to embrace the possibility of love, regardless of the barriers it might bring. She was ready to take the risk, ready to move beyond the limits she had placed on herself. The age gap, the whispers of others, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that in Ian, she had found someone who made her feel alive again. And that, she realized, was worth everything. As she sat there, the soft hum of the night around her, Eleanor smiled to herself. Love, she thought, was never about age. It was about connection, about shared moments, about the beauty of finding someone who could make your world brighter, even in the most unexpected ways. She was ready now, ready to explore what lay ahead with Ian, to see where this path would lead them, with an open heart and no apologies. As Eleanor sat by the window, looking out over the quiet street, she couldn't help but smile. There had been a time when she thought her life was complete, when she believed that all the important moments had already passed her by. But here she was, a woman in her 50s, about to embark on an entirely new chapter of her life, a chapter that was filled with hope, uncertainty, and excitement. She had learned so much over the past few months, about herself, about love, and about the ways in which we often limit ourselves based on society's expectations. Ian had changed everything, not in some grand, dramatic way, but in the way he had simply made her feel like herself again. He had reminded her of the possibilities that lay beyond the routines of daily life, beyond the walls she had built to protect her heart. With him, she felt young again, not in the way that youth is often romanticized, but in the sense that she had rediscovered a part of herself she had buried long ago, her ability to be vulnerable, to be open, to love without hesitation. Eleanor had feared that her age would be a barrier, that the world would look at her differently, judge her for falling for a man so much younger. But in the quiet moments of reflection, she realized something profound. The only person who needed to give her permission to love, to live, was herself. Society could have its opinions, but love didn't follow those rules. It didn't care about age or status, or how many years had passed between two people. It simply was. And so, Eleanor decided to follow her heart, without hesitation. She had a sense of peace now, a calm that came from understanding that love at any stage in life was valid. There would always be obstacles. There would always be those who didn't understand. But Eleanor had made her peace with that. She had the courage to live for herself now, not for the approval of others. She thought of Ian, of the way his eyes lit up when they talked, of the warmth between them. It wasn't perfect, nor did it need to be. What mattered was that it was real. And Eleanor had come to learn that love, in all its forms, was about the journey, about how two people could meet, could grow together, could share their lives in ways that transcended all the other noise. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the room, Eleanor felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She had lived a quiet life, yes, but she had lived it on her terms. And now, at this moment, with her heart open and ready, she was embarking on a new adventure. For the first time in years, Eleanor knew that love wasn't something that happened once and then faded. It was something that could bloom again and again, no matter how old you were, no matter how much life had passed you by. And she was ready for whatever came next. Love, she thought, could be endless. And so, at 50-something, Eleanor was finally learning how to live and love without limits.